They were told that capture meant death, not just physical death, but the death of honor, the erasure of their family name, the end of everything that made them human in the eyes of their ancestors. But on a dusty afternoon in New Mexico in 1944, Hiroshi Tanaka stood outside the barbed wire fence of his prison camp and watched as American guards waved him through the gate to go work unsupervised on a local farm. No chains, no armed escort, just a casual trust that seemed insane, impossible, like handing a loaded weapon to your enemy and turning your back. The guard even smiled and said, "See you at dinner." In broken Japanese he had been learning from the prisoners. Hiroshi walked through that gate into the bright desert sun, and for the first time in his 23 years of life, he understood what the Americans meant by the word freedom. The concept was so foreign to everything he had known that his legs actually stopped working for a moment. He stood there, halfway between the camp and the truck that would take him to work, paralyzed by a choice he had never imagined having. He could run, right now. He could disappear into the vast American landscape and the guards would not shoot him. They might search for him, but they would not execute the other prisoners as punishment. His family back home would not be tortured for his actions. This was the crazy freedom the Americans lived with every day, and it terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. If you're amazed by these hidden stories from history that nobody talks about, please subscribe and hit that notification bell right now. Here's something to think about. What would you do if your enemy gave you more freedom than your own country ever did? How would that change everything you believed? The journey to this moment had begun in the Philippines, where Hiroshi had served as a sergeant in the Imperial Army. The Americans had captured him during the liberation of Luzon, pulled him half dead from a bunker where he and 12 others had held out for 3 weeks, living on rainwater and roots. He had tried to kill himself rather than surrender, as the military code demanded, but his knife had been too dull and his hands too weak from starvation. The American medic who treated his wounds had actually laughed, not cruelly but with something like sympathy, and said through a translator, "You boys really believe all that death before dishonor stuff, don't you?" They had believed it, every word. The emperor was divine, Japan was sacred, death in battle was the highest honor, capture was worse than death. These were not just ideas but the fundamental structure of reality as Hiroshi understood it. The Americans who captured him should have been demons, should have tortured him for information, should have executed him as worthless. Instead, they gave him medical care, food, and eventually shipped him to a prisoner of war camp in New Mexico, where the strangest chapter of his life would begin. The camp looked like nothing he had expected. There were fences, yes, and guard towers with soldiers carrying rifles. But inside the fence was something that looked almost like a small town. Neat barracks with windows and doors that actually closed. A mess hall where prisoners cooked their own food. A recreation area with sports equipment. A library with books in Japanese and English. A workshop where prisoners could learn trades. The American commander had explained through a translator that prisoners were expected to work but would be paid small wages, could buy items from a canteen, could write letters home, could essentially live as a community within certain boundaries. Hiroshi's mind could not process this information. In the Japanese military, discipline meant constant surveillance, instant punishment for the smallest infractions, absolute obedience without question. Here, the Americans seemed to operate on an entirely different principle. They set rules and expected them to be followed, but they did not watch every moment. They did not beat prisoners for minor mistakes. They seemed to believe that men could be trusted to behave reasonably if treated reasonably. This was the first taste of the crazy freedom, and it made no sense. The work assignments began after a week of orientation. Some prisoners worked in the camp kitchen or laundry. Others were assigned to local farms and ranches, desperately short of labor with so many American men fighting overseas. Hiroshi was chosen for farm work because he had grown up in a rural area and knew agriculture. The first morning, 30 Japanese prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven to various farms in the area. Hiroshi and 2 others were dropped at a ranch owned by a man named Peterson, who looked them over and said something in English that the guard translated as, "They look strong enough. I'll have them back by sunset." And then the guard left, just drove away, leaving 3 Japanese soldiers who had recently been trying to kill Americans in the care of a single elderly rancher. Peterson showed them around the ranch, pointed out what needed doing, demonstrated how to use the equipment. He worked alongside them, sweating in the desert heat, treating them not as prisoners but as hired hands. At lunch, he brought them into his house where his wife had prepared sandwiches and cold lemonade. They sat at the family table, eating with real plates and silverware, while Mrs. Peterson asked through gestures and broken phrases about their families back home. This hospitality was incomprehensible. Hiroshi had been taught that Americans were soft, weak, lacking in proper social structure. But here was an American family treating enemy soldiers as guests, showing a confidence that came from strength, not weakness. They were not afraid. They were not even particularly cautious. They seemed to genuinely believe that treating people decently would result in decent behavior in return. And the strangest thing was, they were right. Not one prisoner tried to escape that day or any day after. Back at the camp that evening, the prisoners discussed what they had experienced in hushed, confused tones. The freedom of movement, the trust, the casual assumption that they would honor the implicit agreement to work in return. It violated everything they understood about power and control. In Japan, order was maintained through fear, through constant observation, through the knowledge that deviation meant punishment not just for yourself, but for your family, your entire village sometimes. Here, order seemed to maintain itself through some invisible force that had nothing to do with fear. The camp routine developed its own strange rhythm. Morning count, breakfast, work assignments, return in the evening, dinner, free time until lights out. But that free time was genuinely free in ways that boggled Hiroshi's mind. Prisoners could play sports, study English, read books, write letters, engage in hobbies. They organized their own activities, formed clubs, even published a camp newspaper. The Americans supervised but did not control every aspect of life. They seemed to believe that men needed some measure of autonomy to remain sane, that total control produced something less than human. Hiroshi began studying English in the evenings, partly from boredom but mostly from a growing curiosity about these people who had defeated Japan. The teacher was an American sergeant of Japanese descent, a Nisei whose parents had immigrated to California. This man's very existence challenged everything Hiroshi had been taught. He looked Japanese but was thoroughly American in his manner, his speech, his casual confidence. He talked about growing up in Los Angeles, about joining the army to prove his loyalty after Pearl Harbor, about fighting in Europe while his own parents were held in internment camps. The irony was not lost on Hiroshi. Japanese Americans imprisoned by their own government for their race, while Japanese soldiers who had actually fought against America were treated with remarkable freedom. The Nisei sergeant seemed to understand Hiroshi's confusion and said one evening after class, "America is complicated. We preach freedom but don't always practice it perfectly. But the ideal matters, the attempt matters. Even when we fail, the belief in freedom as a goal makes us try to be better." This was the crazy freedom starting to make sense. It was not the absence of rules, but the presence of choice. It was not chaos, but organized liberty. It was the radical idea that people could be trusted with their own lives, that given options and treated with dignity, most would choose reasonably. The Japanese system assumed the worst of people and controlled accordingly. The American system seemed to assume the best and was surprised when disappointed. Neither was perfect, but one produced a society where people wanted to stay, and the other produced a society where death seemed preferable to capture. The seasons changed, and with them came new freedoms that seemed increasingly absurd. The camp organized education programs where prisoners could learn trades like carpentry, mechanics, and electrical work, real skills that would be valuable after the war. Why would captors train their prisoners in useful skills? It only made sense if they saw prisoners as future citizens of a peaceful world rather than eternal enemies. Some prisoners were allowed to attend religious services in town, Buddhist and Christian alike, sitting in American churches and temples as if nationality mattered less than faith. Hiroshi found work at a different farm as the months passed, one owned by a German immigrant family who had come to America in the 1922. The Schmidts spoke with accents, understood what it meant to be strangers in America, and treated the Japanese prisoners with a particular kindness born of their own experience as outsiders who had become insiders. Mr. Japanese prisoners, Schmidt told Hiroshi one day while they repaired a fence together, "In Germany, I was always just a poor farmer. Here, I own land. My children go to university. This is what America does. It takes people from anywhere and makes them American." The concept of becoming American was something Hiroshi had never considered. In Japan, you were Japanese by blood, by birth, by ancestry stretching back centuries. You could not become Japanese any more than you could become a mountain or a river. But Americans seemed to believe that their identity was about ideas rather than blood, about choosing to believe in certain principles rather than being born into them. This was perhaps the craziest freedom of all, the freedom to transform, to become something different from what you started as. Letters from home arrived irregularly, and each one deepened Hiroshi's confusion about where he belonged. His mother wrote about starvation, about bombing raids, about his younger brother being drafted into a war that was clearly lost. His sister wrote about working in a munitions factory that had no munitions to produce, about propaganda that grew more desperate and divorced from reality with each passing month. They still wrote about honor and duty and the divine emperor, but the words felt hollow compared to the full stomach and peaceful sleep Hiroshi enjoyed as a prisoner of war. The guilt was crushing. His family suffered while he ate 3 meals a day. His country burned while he learned English and played baseball on Sunday afternoons. His friends died in caves and jungles while he earned wages working on farms and bought candy from the camp canteen. But underneath the guilt was a more troubling emotion: relief. Relief that he had been captured. Relief that he had survived. Relief that he was experiencing this strange American freedom rather than dying for an emperor who had led Japan into a war it could never win. News of Germany's surrender reached the camp in May 1945, and the Japanese prisoners knew their own country's defeat was inevitable. The Americans had been showing them newsreels of B-29 bombers over Japanese cities, of the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces ever closer to the homeland. Some prisoners refused to believe it, insisted it was propaganda, clung to the myth of divine wind that would save Japan at the last moment. But Hiroshi had lived among Americans for over a year now. He had seen their industrial capacity, their casual wealth, their organizational ability. Japan had challenged a giant and was being crushed. When news of the atomic bombs reached the camp in August, the Japanese prisoners reacted with stunned silence. Cities erased in seconds. Hundreds of thousands dead from weapons that seemed like something from mythology rather than reality. And then, impossibly, the emperor's voice on the radio, speaking directly to the Japanese people for the first time in history, announcing surrender. The divine voice sounded human, tired, defeated. The prisoners sat in the mess hall listening to the recorded broadcast, and many wept openly, not just for the defeat, but for the shattering of everything they had believed about the world and their place in it. The war was over, but the prisoners were not immediately released. Repatriation would take time, the American officers explained. Japan was occupied, in chaos, struggling to feed its own population. Ships were needed, processing was required, decisions had to be made. In the meantime, life in the camp continued with its strange freedoms. But now those freedoms took on a different meaning. They were no longer the privileges of prisoners, but a preview of what peace might look like. Some prisoners began to express reluctance about returning to Japan. The news from home was grim: starvation, occupation, the complete transformation of Japanese society under American supervision. Here in the camp, they had food, shelter, even purpose. They had learned skills, made friends among the guards and local civilians, discovered parts of themselves that military discipline had never allowed to surface. The idea of returning to a defeated nation, of facing the shame of surrender, of trying to rebuild lives in ruins, seemed overwhelming compared to the stable, if limited, life they had found in New Mexico. Hiroshi was working at the Schmidt farm when Mr. Schmidt made an offer that stopped him cold. "After you go home, if things are too hard, you could come back. I could sponsor you. America needs good workers, and you are a good worker." The words hung in the desert air like a possibility Hiroshi had never imagined. Return to America. Leave Japan. Choose a different life. It was the ultimate expression of the crazy freedom, the ability to choose not just your actions but your entire future, your nationality, your identity. The camp authorities began allowing prisoners more freedoms as repatriation approached. Some were permitted to travel to nearby towns for shopping or entertainment, always with the understanding that they would return. And they did return, every single one, because the trust had become mutual. The Americans trusted them with freedom, and they honored that trust because it was the first time in their lives anyone had trusted them with anything beyond blind obedience. This reciprocal relationship, built on dignity rather than fear, had created something unprecedented. Hiroshi wrote to his mother about his confusion. Though he could not tell her everything, how could he explain that the enemy had treated him better than his own military ever had? How could he describe the feeling of being trusted, of having choices, of discovering that he was capable of self-discipline without external force? How could he admit that part of him did not want to come home, that America's crazy freedom had shown him possibilities he had never known existed? The letter he finally sent said only that he was well and would return soon. The final months in the camp were bittersweet. The prisoners knew they would likely never see each other again, scattered as they would be across Japan. The friendships formed with guards and local civilians would end. The skills learned might have no application in occupied Japan. The English studied might never be used. But the experience of freedom, once tasted, could not be forgotten. It had changed them in ways that would last forever. Repatriation began in early 1946. Ships arrived to take the prisoners back across the Pacific they had once crossed as soldiers. Hiroshi stood on the deck watching the American coast disappear and felt a loss he could not name. He was going home, but home was no longer the place he had left. He was no longer the person who had left it. The crazy freedom of the American camps had shown him that there were different ways to live, different ways to organize society, different relationships between power and people. Japan, when he finally saw it, was everything the letters had warned and worse. Tokyo was rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were moonscapes. People were skeletons walking through ruins, searching for food, for family, for meaning in the aftermath of total defeat. The occupation forces were everywhere, remaking Japanese society according to American principles. Democracy, women's rights, labor unions, land reform, all the crazy freedoms that Hiroshi had experienced in the camp were being imposed on a nation that had never known them. He returned to his village to find his family surviving but broken. His father had died during the war. His brother had been killed in the Philippines, perhaps in the same battle where Hiroshi had been captured. His mother and sister were aged beyond their years, marked by hunger and loss. They welcomed him home but could not understand what he had experienced. When he tried to explain the camp, the freedom, the decent treatment, they listened with polite incomprehension. It sounded like fantasy, like propaganda, like the ramblings of a man whose mind had been broken by capture. Hiroshi found work helping the occupation forces, using his English and his understanding of American ways to bridge the gap between occupiers and occupied. It was considered shameful by some, collaboration with the enemy. But Hiroshi had learned that enemy and friend were not fixed categories, that people could choose how to treat each other, that dignity and respect could exist even between former combatants. The crazy freedom had taught him that. Years later, when Japan had rebuilt itself into something new, when democracy had taken root and prosperity had returned, Hiroshi would think about those days in the New Mexico camp. The freedom he had first experienced as a prisoner had become the foundation of the new Japan. The trust, the dignity, the assumption that people could govern themselves if given the chance, these American ideas had transformed his country, not through conquest but through example, not through force, but through the slow realization that there were better ways to live. He never took Mr. Schmidt up on his offer to return to America, though they exchanged letters for many years. Hiroshi stayed in Japan, married, raised children who grew up in a democracy, who took freedom for granted in ways he never could. But he taught them about the camp, about the guards who trusted prisoners, about the farmers who shared their tables, about the crazy freedom that had seemed impossible until it was simply normal. He taught them that freedom was not the absence of rules, but the presence of choice, not chaos, but responsibility, not weakness, but the ultimate strength. The camp had been meant to hold enemy soldiers until the war ended, but it had done something more profound. It had shown those soldiers a different possibility for human organization, a different relationship between individual and state, a different meaning of strength and dignity. The crazy freedom of the American camps had planted seeds that would grow in unexpected soil, transforming not just individual prisoners but entire societies. It had been subversive in the deepest sense, not through propaganda or force, but through the simple act of treating enemies as human beings capable of choice. Hiroshi lived to see Japan become America's ally, to see the two nations that had tried to destroy each other become partners in peace. He lived to see his grandchildren study in American universities, to see Japanese companies operate in America and American companies in Japan, to see the free movement of people and ideas between nations that had once preached death before dishonor. The crazy freedom had won, not through military victory, but through the slow, patient work of showing people what was possible when trust replaced fear. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be discovered.